Welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to take a couple of minutes of your time and ask for a little bit of support. I mention every week how this show is brought to you by supporters on Patreon, and in the last year or so with the challenges of the COVID and all that sort of nonsense, without that support, the show probably wouldn't have survived that period. So I'm very grateful to the people who've helped me to keep it going and to help me carry on helping others. So if you're someone who's yet making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you to deal with insomnia and sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and of course, if you have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales or go to the link in the show notes or from the website to take a look at what's on offer. Got 2 new members of the Patreon family at the moment are Sharon and Joan, who signed up in the last week. Thank you very much to both of you for support, and I'm very, very grateful and very appreciative. But if signing up for something on a month-to-month basis seems a little bit much, and you're more inclined to make a once-off contribution, then take a look at buymeacoffee.com/sleepytimetales, also linked in the show notes, and there you can, buy me a coffee without even needing to sign up. But another fun way potentially help the show, and something I don't mention a lot lately, is I do have a merchandise store up on Redbubble, which again you can see from the link in the show notes. I'm going to sunset the current designs at the end of April that are up there. So if you're interested in the old chunky text logo with either the blue background or the night sky, this is your chance to get those, and then they're going to be gone and replaced by something new. Well, no, I'm being mysterious, but basically it's just the current new logo. But then also, other than financial help, there's an arguably even bigger way to help Sleepy Time Tales, and that is to spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. Or you can spread the word on social media, and if you recommend the show there on social media, please make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. My tag is @SleepyTimeTales on both Instagram and Twitter. Last but not least, of course, I need to shout out the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. The music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com, and I've linked it in the show notes as they've got some very cool stuff there that they release under various names that I seriously recommend you check out. Thank you for taking the time, and let's get back to the show. So what is Sleepy Time Tales exactly? What is it for? It is a bit of a strange idea, isn't it? It is a podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night with your mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with anxieties of the 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe sometimes background noise, or even company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you, without the pressure of the end coming and potentially stressing you out. As far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. For me, I need something to focus on, a story or an event that lets me keep my mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stresses and anxieties, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for me. But for some people, they need something maybe a little bit different, some kind of background noise, some kind of white noise. Some people may like white noise itself, or the sound of rain, or wind in the trees, or the ocean, or maybe just some boring dude droning on reading you a story that's not particularly interesting. But however you engage with the show and whatever you like about it, the important thing is you don't try to force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the tale and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now obviously I'm hoping that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important that you don't feel pressurized. It may not work on the first night. It probably will actually take 2 or even 3 nights for you to get used to listening to my voice, maybe my accent, or maybe just the strangeness of the idea of listening to a podcast where someone's going to be talking to you in your sleep. It's also possible that one episode just isn't long enough. If you're a chronic late sleeper, maybe you need more than an hour to fall asleep at night. Or maybe your problem isn't so much going to sleep. Maybe your problem is waking up in the middle of the night. What I recommend, because it's what works for me and what I do with the shows I listen to, is I let the podcasts run all night. I playlist the things that I listen to and I download a whole bunch, and then I start with the latest episode and let them run. That way, when I wake up at 3 a.m., as almost inevitably happens, I just pop my earbuds back in with very little effort. The stream is still running and I go straight back to sleep. Sometimes I even do the same thing if I wake up before my alarm goes. I sometimes wake up 30 minutes or 60 minutes before the alarm and I do exactly the same. I carry on listening and I go straight back to sleep again. And while some people may wonder what the point is of getting an extra 30 minutes of sleep, I gotta tell you that when that happens, that can be the best part of my night. There's something about allowing yourself to relax completely right before the alarm that is just satisfying on a whole new, deep, deep level. It is very important, though, that you try and relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. So give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. The Apparition of Mrs. Veal by Daniel Defoe. This thing is so rare in all its circumstances, and on so good authority, that my reading and conversation have not given me anything like it. It is fit to gratify the most ingenious and serious inquirer. Mrs. Bargrave is the person to whom Mrs. Veal appeared after her death. She is my intimate friend, and I can vouch for her reputation for these 15 or 16 years, on my own knowledge, and I can confirm the good character she had from her youth to the time of my acquaintance. Though since this relation, she is culminated by some people that are friends to the brother of Mrs. Veal, who appeared, who think the relation of this appearance to be a reflection, and endeavour what they can to blast Mrs. Bargrave's reputation, and to laugh the story out of countenance. But by the circumstances thereof, and the cheerful disposition of Mrs. Bargrave notwithstanding, the ill usage of a very wicked husband, there is not yet the least sign of dejection in her face. Nor did I ever hear her let fall a desponding or murmuring expression, nay, not when actually under her husband's barbarity, which I have been a witness to, and several other persons of undoubted reputation. Now you must know Mrs. Veal was a maiden gentlewoman of about 30 years of age, and for some years past had been troubled with fits, which were perceived coming on her by her going off her discourse very abruptly to some impertinence. She was maintained by an only brother, and kept his house in Dover. She was a very pious woman, and her brother a very sober man to all appearance. But now he does all he can to null and quash the story. Mrs. Veal was intimately acquainted with Mrs. Bargrave from her childhood. Mrs. Veal's circumstances were then mean. Her father did not take care of his children as he ought, so that they were exposed to hardships. And Mrs. Bargrave in those days had as unkind a father, though she wanted neither for food nor clothing, while Mrs. Veal wanted for both, insomuch as she would often say, "Mrs. Bargrave, you are not only the best, but the only friend I have in the world, and no circumstance of life shall ever dissolve my friendship." They would often condole each other's adverse fortunes, and read together Drelincourt upon death and other good books. And so, like two Christian friends, they comforted each other under their sorrow. Some time after, Mr. Veal's friends got him a place in the custom house at Dover, which occasioned Mrs. Veal, by little and little, to fall off from her intimacy with Mrs. Bargrave, though there was never any such thing as a quarrel, but an indifferency come on by degrees, till at last Mrs. Bargrave had not seen her in 2 years and a half, although above a 12-month of the time Mrs. Bargrave had been absent from Dover, and this last half year had been in Canterbury about 2 months of the time, dwelling in a house of her own. In this house, on the 8th of September, 1705, she was sitting alone in the forenoon, thinking over her unfortunate life, and arguing herself into due resignation to Providence, though her condition seemed hard. "And," said she, "I have been provided for hitherto, and doubt not but I shall be still, and am well satisfied that my affliction shall end when it is most fit for me." And then took up her sewing work, which she had no sooner done but she hears a knocking at the door. She went to see who was there, and this proved to be Mrs. Veal, her old friend, who was in a riding habit. At that moment of time, clock struck 12 at noon. "Madam," says Mrs. Bargrave, "I am surprised to see you. You have been so long a stranger." But told her she was glad to see her, and offered to salute her, which Mrs. Veal complied with, till their lips almost touched, and then Mrs. Veal drew her hand across her own eyes and said, "I'm not very well," and so waved it. She told Mrs. Bargrave she was going on a journey, and had a great mind to see her first. "But," says Mrs. Bargrave, "how can you take a journey alone?" "I am amazed at it, because I know you have a fond brother." "Oh," says Mrs. Veal, "I gave my brother the slip and came away, because I had so great a desire to see you before I took my journey." So Mrs. Bargrave went in with her to another room within the first, and Mrs. Veal sat down in an elbow chair in which Mrs. Bargrave was sitting when she heard Mrs. Veal knock. "Then," says Mrs. Veal, "my dear friend, I'm come to renew our old friendship again, and beg your pardon for my breach of it, and if you can forgive me, you are the best of women." "Oh," said Mrs. Bargrave, "do not mention such a thing. I've had not an uneasy thought about it." "What did you think of me?" says Mrs. Veal. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "I thought you were like the rest of the world, and that prosperity had made you forget yourself and me." Then Mrs. Veal reminded Mrs. Bargrave of the many friendly offices she did in her former days, and much of the conversation they had with each other in the times of their adversity, what books they read, and what comfort in particular they received from Drelincourt's Book of Death, which was the best, she said, on the subject ever wrote. She also mentioned Dr. Sherlock and the 2 Dutch books which were translated, wrote upon death, and several others. But Drelincourt, she said, had the clearest notions of death and of the future state of any who had handled the subject. Then she asked Mrs. Bargrave whether she had Drelincourt. She said yes. Says Mrs. Veal, "Fetch it." And so Mrs. Bargrave goes upstairs and brings it down. Says Mrs. Veal, "Dear Mrs. Bargrave, and the eyes of our faith were as open as the eyes of our body, we should see numbers of angels about us for our guard. The notions we have of heaven now are nothing like what it is, as Drelincourt says. Therefore be comforted under your afflictions, and believe that the Almighty has a particular regard to you, and that your afflictions are marks of God's favour, and when they have done the business they are sent for, they shall be removed from you. And believe me, my dear friend, believe what I say to you. 1 minute of future happiness will infinitely reward you for all your sufferings. For I can never believe," and claps her hand upon her knee with great earnestness, which indeed ran through most of her discourse, "that ever God will suffer you to spend all your days in this afflicted state. But be assured that your afflictions shall leave you, or you them, in a short time. She spake in that parenthetical and heavenly manner that Mrs. Bargrave wept several times, she was so deeply affected with it. Then Mrs. Veal mentioned Dr. Kendrick's ascetic, at the end of which he gives an account of the lives of the primitive Christians. Their pattern she recommended to our imitation, and said, "The conversation was not like this of our age. For now," says she, "there is nothing but vain frothy discourse, which is far different from theirs. Theirs was to edification and to build another up in faith, so that they were not as we are, nor we as they were. But," said she, "we ought to do as they did." There was a hearty friendship among them, but where is it now to be found? Said Mrs. Bargrave. It is hard indeed to find a true friend in these days, says Mrs. Veal. Mr. Norris has a fine copy of verses called Friendship and Perfection, which I wonderfully admire. Have you seen the book? Says Mrs. Veal. No, says Mrs. Bargrave, but I have the verses of my own writing out. Have you? Said Mrs. Veal. Then fetch them. Which she did from above stairs and offered them to Mrs. Veal to read. Refused and waved the thing, saying, holding down her head would make it ache. Then desiring Mrs. Bargrave to read them to her, which she did. As they were admiring friendship, Mrs. Veal said, Dear Mrs. Bargrave, I shall love you forever. In these verses there's twice used the word Elysian. Ah, says Mrs. Veal, these poets have such names for heaven. She would often draw her hand across her own eyes and say, Mrs. Bargrave, do you not think I'm mightily impaired by my fits? No, said Mrs. Bargrave, I think you look as well as I ever knew you. After this discourse, which the apparition put in much finer words than Mrs. Bargrave said she could pretend to, and as much more than she can remember, for it cannot be thought that an hour and 3/4 conversation could all be retained, though the main of it she thinks she does, she said to Mrs. Bargrave she would have her write a letter to her brother, and tell him she would have to give him rings to such, and that there were a purse of gold in her cabinet, and that she would have 2 broad pieces given to her cousin Watson. Talking at this rate, Mrs. Bargrave thought that a fit was coming upon her, and so placed herself on a chair just before her knees to keep her from falling to the ground, if her fit should occasion it, for the elbow chair she thought would keep her from falling on either side. And to divert Mrs. Veal, as she thought, took hold of her gown sleeve several times and commended it. Mrs. Veal told her it was a scoured silk and newly made up, but for all this Mrs. Veal persisted in her request, and told Mrs. Bargrave she must not deny her, and she would have her tell her brother all their conversation when she had the opportunity. Dear Mrs. Veal, says Mrs. Bargrave, this seems so impertinent that I cannot tell how to comply with it, and what a mortifying story will our conversation be to a young gentleman. Why, says Mrs. Bargrave, it is much better, methinks, to do it yourself. No, says Mrs. Veal, though it seems impertinent to you now, you'll see more reasons for it hereafter. Mrs. Bargrave then, to satisfy her importunity, was going to fetch a pen and ink, but Mrs. Veal said, let it alone now, but do it when I'm gone, but you must be sure to do it, which was one of the last things she enjoined her at parting, and so she promised her. Then Mrs. Veal asked for Mrs. Bargrave's daughter. She said she was not at home. But if you have a mind to see her, says Mrs. Bargrave, I'll send for her. Do, says Mrs. Veal, on which she left her and went to her neighbour's to see her, and by the time Mrs. Bargrave was returning, Mrs. Veal was got without the door in the street, in the face of the beast market on a Saturday, which is market day, and stood ready to part as soon as Mrs. Bargrave came to her. She asked her why she was in such haste. She said she must be going, though perhaps she might not go to her journey till Monday, and told Mrs. Bargrave she hoped that she would see her again at cousin Watson's before she went whither she was going. Then she said she would take her leave of her, and walked from Mrs. Bargrave, in her view, till her turning interrupted the sight of her, which was 1:15 in the afternoon. Mrs. Veal died the 7th of September at 12 o'clock at noon of her fits, and had not above 4 hours' senses before her death, in which time she received the sacrament. The next day after Mrs. Veal's appearance being Sunday, Mrs. Bargrave was mightily indisposed with a cold and sore throat, that she could not go out that day. But on Monday morning she sends a person to Captain Watson's to know if Mrs. Veal was there. They wondered at Mrs. Bargrave's inquiry and sent her word she was not there, nor was expected. At this answer, Mrs. Bargrave told the maid she certainly mistook the name or made some blunder. And though she was ill, she put on her hood and went herself to Captain Watson's, though she knew none of the family, to see if Mrs. Veal was there or not. They said they wondered at her asking, for that she had not been in town. They were sure, if she had, she would have been there. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "I am sure she was with me on Saturday almost 2 hours." They said it was impossible, for they must have seen her if she had. In comes Captain Watson while they were in dispute, and said that Mrs. Veal was certainly dead, and the escutcheons were making. This strangely surprised Mrs. Bargrave, who she sent to the person immediately who had the care of them and found it true. Then she related the whole story to Captain Watson's family, and what gown she had on and how striped, and that Mrs. Veal had told her it was scoured. Then Mrs. Watson cried out, "Have you seen her indeed? For none knew but Mrs. Veal and myself that the gown was scoured." And Mrs. Watson owned that she described the gown exactly, for, said she, I helped her to make it up. This Mrs. Watson blazed all about the town and avouched the demonstration of truth of Mrs. Bargrave seeing Mrs. Veal's apparition. And Captain Watson carried 2 gentlemen immediately to Mrs. Bargrave's house to hear the relation from her own mouth. And when it spread so fast that gentlemen and persons of quality, the judicious and sceptical part of the world, flocked in upon her, for it at last became such a task that she was forced to go out of the way, for they were in general extremely satisfied of the truth of the thing, and plainly saw that Mrs. Bargrave was no hypochondriac, for she always appears with such a cheerful air and pleasing mien that she has gained the favour and esteem of all the gentry, and it is thought a great favour if they can but get the relation from her own mouth. I should have told you before that Mrs. Veal told Mrs. Bargrave that her sister and brother-in-law would just come down from London to see her. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "How came you to order matters so strangely?" "I could not be helped," said Mrs. Veal. And her brother and sister did come to see her, and entered the town of Dover just as Mrs. Veal was expiring. Mrs. Bargrave asked her whether she should drink some tea. Says Mrs. Veal, "I do not care if I do, but I'll warrant you this mad fellow," meaning Mrs. Bargrave's husband, "has broken all your trinkets." "But," says Mrs. Bargrave, "I'll get something to drink in for all that." But Mrs. Veal waved it and said, "That is no matter, let it alone." And so it passed. All the time I sat with Mrs. Bargrave, which was some hours, she recollected fresh sayings of Mrs. Veal. And one material thing more she told Mrs. Bargrave, that old Mr. Breton allowed Mrs. Veal £10 a year, which was a secret, and unknown to Mrs. Bargrave till Mrs. Veal told her. Mrs. Bargrave never varies in her story, which puzzles those who doubt of the truth or unwilling to believe it. A servant in the neighbour's yard adjoining to Mrs. Bargrave's house heard her talking to somebody an hour of the time Mrs. Veal was with her. Mrs. Bargrave went out to her next neighbour's the very moment she parted with Mrs. Veal, and told her what ravishing conversation she had with an old friend, and told the whole of it. Drelincourt's Book of Death is, since this happened, brought up strangely, and it is to be observed that notwithstanding all the trouble and fatigue Mrs. Bargrave had undergone upon this account, she never took a value of a farthing, nor suffered her daughter to take anything of anybody, and therefore can have no interest in telling the story. But Mr. Veal does what he can to stifle the matter, and said he would see Mrs. Bargrave. But yet it is still matter of fact that he has never been at Captain Watson since the death of his sister, and yet never went near Mrs. Bargrave. And some of his friends report her to be a liar, and that she knew of Mr. Bretton's £10 a year. But the person who pretends to say so has the reputation to be a notorious liar among persons whom I know to be of undoubted credit. Now Mr. Veal is more of a gentleman than to say she lies, but says a bad husband has crazed her. But she needs only present herself, and it will effectually confute that pretense. Mr. Veal says he asked his sister on her deathbed whether she had a mind to dispose of anything, and she said no. Now the things which Mrs. Veal's apparition would have disposed of were so trifling and nothing of justice aimed at in the disposal, that the design of it appears to me only to be in order to make Mrs. Bargrave satisfy the world of the reality thereof as to what she had seen and heard, and to secure her reputation among the reasonable and understanding part of mankind. And then again, Mr. Veal owns that there was a purse of gold, but it was not found in her cabinet, but in a comb box. This looks improbable, for that Mr. Watson owned that Mrs. Veal had so very carefully of the key of her cabinet that she would trust nobody with it, and if so, no doubt she would not trust her gold out of it. And Mrs. Veal's often drawing her hands over her eyes and asking Mrs. Bargrave whether her fits had not impaired her, looks to me as if she did it on purpose to remind Mrs. Bargrave of her fits, to prepare her not to think it strange that she should put upon writing to her brother to dispose of rings and gold, which looked so much like a dying person's request. And it took accordingly with Mrs. Bargrave as the effect of her fits coming upon her, and was one of the many instances of her wonderful love to her, and care of her, that she could not be affrighted, which indeed appears in her whole management, particularly in her coming to her in the daytime, waving the salutation, and when she was alone and in the manner of her parting, to prevent a second attempt to salute her. Now while Mr. Veal would think this relation a reflection, as it is plain he does, by his endeavouring to stifle it, I cannot imagine, because the generality believe her to be a good spirit. Her discourse was so heavenly. Her two great errands were to comfort Mrs. Bargrave in her affliction, and to ask her forgiveness for a breach of friendship, and with a pious discourse to encourage her. So that, after all, to suppose that Mrs. Bargrave would hatch such an invention as this, from Friday noon to Saturday noon, supposing that she knew of Mrs. Veal's death the very first moment, without jumbling circumstances, and without any interest too, she must be more witty, fortunate, and wicked too than any indifferent person, I dare say, will allow. I asked Mrs. Bargrave several times if she was sure she felt the gown. She answered modestly, "If my sense is to be relied on, I am sure of it." I asked her if she heard a sound when she clapped her hand upon her knee. She said she did not remember she did, but she appeared to be as much a substance as I did who talked with her. "And I may," said she, "be as soon persuaded that your apparition is talking to me now as I did not really see her. For I was under no manner of fear, and received her as a friend, and parted with her as such. I would not," says she, "give 1 farthing to make anyone believe it. I have no interest in it. Nothing but trouble is entailed upon me for a long time, for what I know, and had it not come to light by accident, it would never have been made public. But now she says she'll make her own private use of it, and keep herself out of the way as much as she can, and so she has done since. She says she had a gentleman who came 30 miles to her to hear the relation, and that she had told it to a room full of people at the same time. Several particular gentlemen have had the story from Mrs. Bargrave's own mouth. This thing has very much affected me, and I am as well satisfied as I am of the best grounded matter of fact. And why we should dispute matter of fact because we cannot solve things of which we cannot have no certainty or demonstrative notion seems strange to me. Mrs. Bargrave's authority and sincerity alone would have made it undoubted in any other case. From Time and the Gods, by Lord Dunsany. When the gods slept. All the gods were sitting in Pagana, and their slave, Time, lay idle at Pagana's gate, with nothing to destroy. When they thought of worlds, worlds large and round and gleaming, and little silver moons. Then, who knoweth when, As the gods raised their hands, making the sign of the gods, the thoughts of the gods became worlds and silver moons, and the worlds swam by Pagana's gate to take their places in the sky, to ride at anchor forever, each where the gods had bidden. And because they were round and big and gleamed all over the sky, the gods laughed and shouted and all clapped their hands. Then upon the earth the gods played out the game of the gods, the game of life and death, and on the other worlds they did a secret thing, playing a game that is hidden. At last they mocked no more at life, and laughed at death no more, and cried aloud in Pagana, will no new thing be? Must these four march forever round the world till our eyes are wearied with the treading of the feet of seasons that will not cease, while night and day and life and death drearily rise and fall? And as a child stares at the bare walls of a narrow hut, so the gods looked all listlessly upon the world, saying, will no new things be? And in their weariness the gods said, to be young again, to be fresh once more from the brain of Yana Yod Sushai. And they turned away their eyes in weariness from all the gleaming worlds, and laid them down upon Pagana's floor, for they said, it may be that the worlds shall pass, and we would fain forget them. Then the gods slept. Then did the comet break loose from his moorings, and the eclipse roamed about the sky, and down on earth did death's three children, famine, pestilence, and drought, come out to feed. The eyes of the famine were green, and the eyes of the drought were red. But the pestilence was blind, and smote all about him with his claws among the cities. But as the gods slept, there came from beyond the rim, out of the dark and unknown, three Yozis, spirits of ill that sailed up the river of silence in galleons with silver sails. Far away they had seen Yum and Gotham, the stars that stand stencil over Pagana's gate, blinking and falling asleep. And as they neared Pagana, they found a hush wherein the gods slept heavily. Ya, Ha, and Snurg were those three great Yozis, the lords of evil, madness, and of spite. When they crept from their galleons and stole over Pagana's silent threshold, it boded ill for the gods. There in Pagana lay the gods asleep, and in a corner lay the power of the gods, alone upon the floor. A thing wrought of black rock, and 4 words graven upon it, whereof I might not give thee any clue, even if I should find it. 4 words of which none knoweth. Some say they tell of the opening of the flower towards dawn, and others say they concern earthquakes among hills, and others that they tell of the death of fishes, and others that the words be these, power, knowledge, forgetting, and another word that not the gods themselves may ever guess. Those words the Yozis read and sped away in dread, lest the gods should wake, and going aboard their galleons bade their rowers haste. Thus the Yozis became gods, having the power of gods, and they sailed away to the earth and came upon a mountainous island in the sea. There they sat upon the rocks, sitting as the gods sit, with their right hands uplifted, and having the power of gods, only none come to worship. Thither came no ships nigh them, nor ever at evening came the prayers of men, nor smell of incense, nor screams from the sacrifice. Then said the Yozis, of what avails it that we be gods, if none worship us, nor give us sacrifice? And Ya, Ha, and Snurg set sail in their silver galleons, and went looming down the sea to come to the shores of men. And first they came to an island where there were fisher folk, and the folk of the island, running down to the shore, cried out to them, who be ye? And the Yozis answered, we be 3 gods, and we would have your worship. But the fisher folk answered, here we worship Ram, the thunder, and have no worship nor sacrifice for other gods. Then the Yozis snarled with anger, and sailed away, and sailed till they came to another shore, sandy and low and forsaken. And at last they found an old man upon the shore, and they cried out to him, old man upon the shore, we be 3 gods that it were well to worship, gods of great power, and apt in the granting of prayer. The old man answered, We worship Pagana's gods, who have a fondness for our incense and the sound of our sacrifices when it squeals upon the altar. Then answered Snoge, Asleep are Pagana's gods, nor will they wake from the humming of the prayers which lie in the dust upon Pagana's floor. And over them Snorokte, the spider of the worlds, hath woven a web of mist, and the squealing of the sacrifice maketh no music in ears that are closed in sleep. The old man answered, standing upon the shore, Though all the gods of old shall answer our prayers no longer, yet still to the gods of old shall all men pray here in Syrianus. But the Yozis turned their ships about and angrily sailed away, all cursing Syrianus and Syrianus's gods, but most especially the old man that stood upon the shore. Still the three Yozis lusted for the worship of men, and came on the third night of their sailing to a city's lights, and nearing the shore they found it, a city of song wherein all folks rejoiced. Then sat each Yozi on his galleon's prow, and leered with his eyes upon the city, so that the music stopped and the dancing ceased, and all looked out to sea at the strange shapes of the Yozis beneath the silver sails. Then Snoge demanded their worship, promising increase of joys, and swearing by the light of his eyes that it would set little flames to leap over the grass, to pursue the enemies of that city, and to chase them about the world. But the people answered that in that city men worshipped Agrodon, the mountain standing alone, and might not worship other gods, even though they came in galleons with silver sails sailing from over the sea. But Snoge answered, Certainly Agrodon is only a mountain, and in no manner a god. But the priests of Agrodon sang for answer from the shore, If the sacrifice of men make not Agrodon a god, nor blood still young on the rocks, nor the little fluttering prayers of 1,000 hearts, nor 2,000 years of worship, and all the hopes of the people and the whole strength of our race, then there are no gods, and ye be common sailors sailing from over the sea. Then said the Yozis, Hath Agrodon answered prayer? And the people heard the words that the Yozis said. Then went the priests of Agrodon away from the shore and up the steep streets of the city, the people following, and over the moor beyond it to the foot of Agrodon, and then said, Agrodon, if thou art our god, go back and herd with yonder common hills, and put a cap of snow upon thy head, and crouch far off as thou do beneath the sky. But if we have given thee divinity in 2,000 years, if our hopes are all about thee like a cloak, then stand up and look upon thy worshippers from over our city forever. And the smoke that ascended from his feet stood still, and there fell a hush over great Agrodon. And the priest went to the sea and said to the three Yozis, New gods shall have our worship when Agrodon grows weary of being our god, or when in some night time he shall stride away, leaving us naught to gaze at that is higher than our city. And the Yozis sailed away and cursed towards Agrodon, but could not hurt him, for he was but a mountain. And the Yozis sailed along the coast till they came to a river running to the sea, and they sailed up the river till they came to a people at work, who furrowed the soil and sowed and strove against the forest. Then the Yozis called to the people as they worked in the fields, Give us your worship, and ye shall have many joys. But the people answered, We may not worship you. Then answered Snoge, Ye also, have ye a god? And the people answered, We worship the years to come, and we set the world in order for their coming, as one layeth raiment on the road before the advent of a king. And when those years shall come, they shall accept the worship of a race they know not, and their people shall make their sacrifices to the years that follow them, who in turn shall minister to the end. Then answered Snoge, Gods that shall recompense you not, rather give us your prayers and have our pleasures, the pleasures that we shall give you, and when your gods shall come, let them be wrath, they cannot punish you. But the people continued to sacrifice their labor to their gods, the years to come, making the world a place for gods to dwell in, and the Yozis cursed those gods and sailed away. And Yah, the Lord of Malice, swore that when those years should come, they should see whether it were well for them to have snatched away the worship from 3 Yozis. And still the Yozis sailed, for they said, "It were better to be birds than have no air to fly in, than to be gods having neither prayers nor worship." But where the sky met with ocean, the Yozis saw land again, and thither sailed. And there the Yozis saw men in strange old garments performing ancient rites in the land of many temples. And the Yozis called to the men as they performed their ancient rites and said, "We be 3 gods, well versed in the needs of men, to worship whom were to obtain instant joy." But the men said, "We have already gods." And Snoeg replied, "Ye too?" The men answered, "For we worship the things that have been, and all the years that were. Divinely have they helped us, therefore we give them worship that is their due." And the Yozis answered the people, "We be gods of the present, and return good things for worship." But the people answered, saying from the shore, "Our gods have given us already the good things, and we return them the worship that is their due." And the Yozis set their face to landwards, and cursed all things that they had been, and all the years that were, and sailed their galleons away. A rocky shore in an inhuman land stood up against the sea. Thither the Yozis came and found no man, but out of the dark from inland towards evenings came a herd of great baboons, and chattered greatly when they saw the ships. Thus spake Snoeg to them, "Have ye too a god?" And the baboons spat. Then said the Yozis, "We be seductive gods, having a particular remembrance for little prayers." But the baboons leered fiercely at the Yozis, and would have none of them for gods. One said that prayers hindered the eating of nuts, but Snoeg leaned forward and whispered, and the baboons went down upon their knees and clasped their hands as men clasp, and chattered prayer, and said to one another that these were the gods of old, and gave the Yozis their worship, for Snoeg had whispered in their ears that if they would worship the Yozis, he would make them men. And the baboons arose from worshipping, smoother about the face and a little shorter in the arms, and went away and hid their bodies in clothing, and afterwards galloped away from the rocky shore, and went and herded with men. And men could not discern what they were, for their bodies were the bodies of men, though their souls were still the souls of beasts, and their worship went to the Yozis, spirits of ill. And the lords of malice, hatred and madness sailed back to their island in the sea, and sat upon the shore as gods sit, with right hand uplifted, and evening foul prayers from the baboons gathered about them and infested the rocks. But in Pagana the gods awoke with a start. From the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen, The Old House. A very old house stood once in a street, with several that were quite new and clean. The date of its erection had been carved on one of the beams and surrounded by scrolls formed of tulips and hop tendrils. By this date it could be seen that the old house was nearly 300 years old. Verses too were written over the windows in old-fashioned letters, and grotesque faces, curiously carved, grinned at you from under the cornices. One story projected a long way over the other, and under the roof ran a leaden gutter with a dragon's head at the end. The rain was intended to pour out at the dragon's mouth, but it ran out of its body instead, for there was a hole in the gutter. The other houses in the street were new and well built, with large window panes and smooth walls. Anyone could see they had nothing to do with the old house. Perhaps they thought, how long will that heap of rubbish remain here to be a disgrace to the whole street? The parapet projects so far forward that no one can see out of our windows what is going on in that direction. The stairs are as broad as the staircase of a castle and as steep as if they led to a church tower. The iron railing looks like the gate of a cemetery, and there are brass knobs upon it. It is really too ridiculous. Opposite to the old house were more nice new houses, which are just the same opinion as their neighbours. At the window of one of them sat a little boy with fresh rosy cheeks and clear sparkling eyes who was very fond of the old house, in sunshine or in moonlight. He would sit and look at the wall from which the plaster had in some places fallen off and fancy all sorts of scenes which had been in former times. How the street must have looked when the houses all had gable roofs, open staircases and gutters with dragons at the spout. He could even see soldiers walking about with halberds. Certainly it was a very good house to look to for amusement. An old man lived in it, who wore knee breeches, a coat with large brass buttons, and a wig, which anyone could see was a real wig. Every morning an old man came to clean the rooms and to wait upon him. Otherwise the old man in the knee breeches would have been quite alone in the house. Sometimes he came to one of the windows and looked out. Then the little boy nodded to him, and the old man nodded back again, till they became acquainted and were friends, although they had never spoken to each other. But that was of no consequence. The little boy one day heard his parents say, "The old man opposite is very well off, but is terribly lonely." The next Sunday morning the little boy wrapped something in a piece of paper and took it to the door of the old house, and said to the attendant who waited upon the old man, "Will you please give this from me to the gentleman who lives here? I have 2 tin soldiers, and this is one of them, and he shall have it, because I know he is terribly lonely." And the old attendant nodded and looked very pleased, and then he carried the tin soldier into the house. Afterwards he was sent over to ask the little boy if he would not like to pay a visit himself. His parents gave him permission, and so it was that he gained admission to the old house. The brassy knobs of the railings shone more brightly than ever, as if they had been polished on account of his visit, and on the door were carved trumpeters standing in tulips, and it seemed as if they were blowing with all their might, their cheeks were so puffed out. "Tun-ta-ra-ra, the little boy is coming, tun-ta-ra-ra, the little boy is coming." Then the door opened. All round the hall hung old portraits of knights in armour and ladies in silk gowns. And the armour rattled, and the silk dresses rustled. Then came a staircase which went up a long way, and then came down a little way, and led to a balcony which was in a very ruinous state. There were large holes and long cracks, out of which grew grass and leaves. Indeed, the whole balcony, the courtyard, and the walls were so overgrown with green that they looked like a garden. In the balcony stood flower pots on which were heads having asses' ears, but the flowers in them grew just as they pleased. In one pot pinks were growing all over the sides. At least the green leaves were shooting forth stalk and stem, and saying as plainly as they could speak, "The air has fanned me, the sun has kissed me, and I am promised a little flower for next Sunday, really for next Sunday." Then they entered a room in which the walls were covered with leather, and the leather had golden flowers stamped on it. "Gilding will fade in damp weather. Ginger, there's nothing like leather," said the walls. Chairs handsomely carved, with elbows at each side, and with very high backs, stood in the room, and as they creaked, they seemed to say, "Sit down. Oh dear, how I'm creaking. I shall certainly have the gout like the old cupboard. Gout in my back, oh." And then the little boy entered the room where the old man sat. "Thank you for the tin soldier, my little friend," said the old man, "and thank you also for coming to see me." "Thanks, thanks," or "creak, creak," said all the furniture. There was so much that the pieces of furniture stood in each other's way to get a sight of the little boy. On the wall near the centre of the room hung the picture of a beautiful lady, young and gay, dressed in the stuff from the fashion of olden times, with powdered hair and a full stiff skirt. She said neither thanks nor creak, but she looked down upon the little boy with her mild eyes, and then he said to the old man, "Where did you get that picture?" "From the shop opposite," he replied. "Many portraits hang there that none seem to trouble themselves about. The persons they represent have been dead and buried long since. But I knew this lady many years ago, and she has been dead nearly half a century. Under a glass beneath the picture hung a nosegay of withered flowers, which were no doubt half a century old too. At least they appeared so. And the pendulum of the old clock went to and fro, and the hands turned round. But as time passed on, everything in the room grew older, but no one seemed to notice it. "They say at home," said the little boy, "that you are very lonely." "Oh," replied the old man, "I have pleasant thoughts of all that has passed, recalled by memory. And now you are come to visit me, and that is very pleasant." Then he took from the bookcase a book full of pictures representing long processions of wonderful coaches, such as are never seen at the present time. Soldiers like the knave of clubs and citizens with waving banners. The tailors had a flag with a pair of scissors supported by 2 lions, and on the shoemaker's flag they were not boots, but an eagle with 2 heads, for the shoemakers must have everything arranged so that they can say, "This is a pair." What a picture book it was! And then the old man went into another room to fetch apples and nuts. It was very pleasant, certainly, to be in that old house. "I cannot endure it," said the tin soldier, who stood on a shelf. "It is so lonely and dull here. I've been accustomed to live in a family, and I cannot get used to this life. I cannot bear it. The whole day is long enough, but the evening is longer. It is not here like it was in your house opposite, when your father and mother talked so cheerfully together, while you and all the dear children made such a delightful noise. No, it is all lonely in the old man's house. Do you think he gets any kisses? Do you think he ever has any friendly looks or a Christmas tree? He will have nothing now but the grave. Oh, I cannot bear it." "You must not look only on the sorrowful side," said the little boy. "I think everything in this house is beautiful, and all the old pleasant thoughts come back here to pay visits." "Ah, but I never see any, and I don't know them," said the tin soldier, "and I cannot bear it." "You must bear it," said the little boy. Then the old man came back with a pleasant face and brought him beautiful preserved fruits, as well as apples and nuts, and the little boy thought no more of the tin soldier. How happy and delighted the little boy was, and after he returned home, and while days and weeks passed, a great deal of nodding took place from one house to the other, and then the little boy went to pay another visit. The carved trumpeters blew, "Tantan Tara." There's a little boy, "Tanta Rara." The swords and armor in the old knight's pictures rattled. The silk dresses rustled. The leather repeated its rhyme, and the old chairs had the gout in their backs and cried creak. It was all exactly like the first time, for in that house 1 day and 1 hour were just like another. "I cannot bear it any longer," said the tin soldier. "I have wept tears of tin. It is so melancholy here. Let me go to the wars and lose an arm or a leg, and it would be some change. I cannot bear it. Now I know what it is to have visits from old recollections, and all they bring with them. I've had visits from mine, and you may believe me, it is not altogether pleasant. I was very nearly jumping from the shelf. I saw you all in your house opposite, as if you were really present. It was Sunday morning, and you children stood around the table singing the hymn that you sing every morning. You were standing quietly with your hands folded, and your father and mother. You were standing quietly with your hands folded, and your father and mother looking just as serious when the door opened, and your little sister Maria, who is not 2 years old, was brought into the room. You know she always dances when she hears music and singing of any sort, so she began to dance immediately, although she ought not to have done so. But she could not get into the right time because the tune was so slow. So she stood first on one leg and then on the other, and bent her head very low, but it would not suit the music. You all stood looking very grave, although it was very difficult to do so. But I laughed so to myself that I fell down from the table and got a bruise, which is there still. I know it was not right to laugh, so all this and everything else that I have seen keeps me running in my head, and these must be the old recollections that bring so many thoughts with them. Tell me whether you still sing on Sundays, and tell me about your little sister Maria, and how my old comrade is, the other tin soldier. Oh, really, he must be very happy. I cannot endure this life. You are given away, said the little boy. You must stay. Don't you see that?" Then the old man came in with a box containing many curious things to show him. Rouge pots, scent boxes, and old cards, so large and so richly gilded that none had ever seen like them in these days. And there were smaller boxes to look at, and the piano was opened, and inside the lid were painted landscapes. But when the old man played the piano, it sounded quite out of tune. Then he looked at the picture which he had brought at the broker's, and his eyes sparkled brightly as he nodded at it, and said, "Ah, she could sing that tune." "I'll go to the wars, I'll go to the wars," cried the tin soldier as loud as he could, and threw himself down on the floor. Where could he have fallen? The old man searched and the little boy searched, but he was gone and could not be found. "I shall find him again," said the old man, but he did not find him. The boards of the floor were open and full of holes. The tin soldier had fallen through a crack between the boards and lay there now in an open grave. The day went by and the little boy returned home. The week passed and many more weeks. It was winter and the windows were quite frozen, so the little boy was obliged to breathe on the panes and rub a hole to peep through to the old house. Snowdrifts were lying in all the scrolls and on the inscriptions, and the steps were covered with snow as if no one were at home. And indeed no one was at home, for the old man was dead. In the evening a hearse stopped at the door, and the old man in his coffin was placed in it. He was to be taken to the country to be buried there in his own grave, so they carried him away. No one followed him, for all his friends were dead, and the little boy kissed his hand to the coffin as the hearse moved away with it. A few days after, there was an auction at the old house, and from his window the little boy saw the people taking away the pictures of the old knights and ladies, the flower pots with the long ears, the old chairs in the cupboards. Some were taken one way, some another. Her portrait, which had been bought at the picture dealer's, went back again to his shop, and there it remained, for no one seemed to know her or to care for the old picture. In the spring, they began to pull the house itself up down. People called it complete rubbish. From the street could be seen the room in which the walls were covered with leather, ragged and torn, and the green in the balcony hung straggling over the beams. They pulled it down quickly, for it looked ready to fall, and at last it was cleared away altogether. "What a good riddance," said the neighbours' houses. Very shortly, a fine new house was built further back from the road. It had lofty windows and smooth walls, but in front, on the spot where the old house really stood, a little garden was planted, and wild vines grew up over the neighbouring walls. In front of the garden were large iron railings and a great gate, which looked very stately. People used to stop and peep through the railings. The sparrows assembled in dozens upon the wild vines and chattered all together as loud as they could, but not about the old house. None of them could remember it, for many years had passed by. So many indeed that the little boy was now a man, and a really good man too, and his parents were very proud of him. He was just married and had come with his young wife to reside in the new house with the garden in front of it, and now he stood there by her side while she planted a field flower that she thought very pretty. She was planting it herself with her little hands and pressing down the earth with her fingers. "Oh dear, what was that?" she exclaimed as something pricked her. Out of the soft earth something was sticking up. It was, only think, it was really the tin soldier, the very same which had been lost up in the old man's room and had been hidden among the old wood and rubbish for a long time, till it sunk into the earth, where it must have been for many years. And the young wife wiped the soldier, first with a green leaf, and then with a fine pocket handkerchief that smelt of such beautiful perfume. And the tin soldier felt as if he was recovering from a fainting fit. "Let me see him," said the young man, and then he smiled and shook his head and said, "It can scarcely be the same, but it reminds me of something that happened to one of my tin soldiers when I was a little boy." And then he told his wife about the old house and the old man, and of the tin soldier which he had sent across, because he thought the old man was lonely. And he related the story so clearly that tears came into the eyes of the young wife, for the old house and the old man. "It is very likely that this is really the same soldier," said she, "and I will take care of him and always remember what you have told me. But some day you must show me the old man's grave." "I don't know where it is," he replied. "No one knows. All his friends are dead, no one took care of him, and I was only a little boy." "Oh, how dreadfully lonely he must have been," said she. "Yes, terribly lonely," cried the tin soldier. "Still, it is delightful not to be forgotten." "Delightful indeed," cried a voice quite near to them. No one but the tin soldier saw it came from a rag of the leather which hung in tatters. It had lost all its gilding and looked like wet earth, but it had an opinion and spoke it thus: "Gilding will fade in damp weather, to endure there is nothing like leather." But the tin soldier did not believe any such thing. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.